I'm David Tryhorn.
And I'm Ben Nicholas, and we are the co-directors of the Netflix documentary El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair.
And you're listening to us on the Seleção Podcast.
Simões bending one for Torres. Eusebio. Oh my word! Have you ever seen anything like that?
Bem jogado por Simão, a passar por dois adversários, Simão, a tentar oferecer o golo a Figo e a bola é golo! O golo de Figo!
Rui Costa já acreditou, vai tirar para o golo, atira o golo! 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 Cristiano Ronaldo, vai embora Cristiano Ronaldo! Mete, bateu, golo! Chuta! Gol!
And we welcome you to a special edition of the Seleção Podcast, a proud partner of Portugal.net. My name is Danny Pinto. I am your host. Thank you guys so much for tuning in once again to the podcast, a special one, as I mentioned, as we won't be talking about anything regarding the current national team. We're going to be talking about one of the legends of our national team, which is Luis Figo, and his controversial transfer from Barca to Real Madrid. Obviously, if you have been living under a rock, or unless you have, I should say, you know that there is a Netflix documentary about that transfer, El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair, and we are lucky enough to have the directors of that documentary, David Tryhorn and Ben Nicholas, on with us here on this special edition of the Seleção Podcast. Gentlemen, first of all, good afternoon to you guys, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Danny.
Thank you, Danny.
You know what, David, I want to start with you. There was an article on the documentary, and you were quoted, I think it's from realscreen.com, and you're quoted as saying, "It's increasingly hard to find sports documentaries that are saying something new, that aren't simply biographies or histories of sporting successes. Focusing on the transfer rather than Luis Figo's career, the film informs us about truth, greed, morality, and the inner workings of the world's most popular sport." I think it's a great spot to start right there. Obviously, you know, when you talk about sports, and I even mentioned this to you guys in the preview to the pre-interview, I should say, and that word "pre" is very important in this documentary. I noticed that as well. But just how, you know, and this, honestly, the quotes from David, but obviously this question's for both of you. How did this idea come to you guys? What was the nexus of it, and how did it all get started?
I did say that, so you're right on that account. I think it's true. I think going back to that quote, I think there are a lot of, this is a golden era, I guess, at the moment for sports documentaries. There's almost a new sports doc coming out every week or every couple of weeks. There's always someone saying, "Have you seen such and such film?" And generally they are biographies, or generally they do go down a certain pattern, I think, or they do follow a certain pattern. And I think Ben and I wanted to make something that just felt a little bit different. And ultimately, we turn a transfer that took place over about 3 weeks, and nothing illegal happens.
It depends on who you ask, I think.
Yeah, no I guess so. No crimes are really committed. It's essentially, you know, it's a football transfer. It's a human resources story. But we make it into, or we'd like to feel we make it into almost like a true crime thriller. And that's where this story perhaps differs from usual sports stories. Going back to your question in terms of kind of how this came about, it was developed at Pitch International, the company, the production company behind it, where we work. And it was actually developed while we were still finishing Pele, the previous film we made for Netflix. And I think when it first came, both Ben and I were a little bit like, well, I'm not too sure about this. I don't know whether this is a film. The initial treatment was much more a sort of wider thesis of how the transfer plays into the bigger rivalry between Barca and Madrid, and going much more into the history of that rivalry. But yeah, we were a little skeptical at first. And I think our points of skepticism were, is there going to be enough archive? This is something that largely happens behind closed doors. Are we going to get any of the main players to speak? We want to make something definitive here. We need the main people, and there are specifically 5 really involved in the deal. We need all 5 of those people to make this feel like a worthwhile project. If we can get to those 5 people, are they actually going to speak openly, at length, honestly? The last one doesn't really matter. But I think those were our 3 sort of major concerns going in. But, as soon as we started doing a bit of research, as soon as we started the pre-production process of really digging into the story, we were actually really excited what this film could be.
I think that is actually, that's the main thing, because I think we always kind of love the story. We always loved the characters involved. We love the era. It's our kind of prime era for us as kind of young football fans at the time. But initially, we maybe felt it was the kind of story you would read a great book about, or read a great long article about, or even a podcast about. Because I think in those things, you can often make them exciting and dramatic by doing a kind of a friend of a friend said this, or there were rumors in the dressing room that this guy said this, but in a film, I think that will kind of kill you. I think you need to have that. You need to feel like you're in touching distance of the story. You need to feel like you're in the room with the guys doing the deal. So I think, as Dave says, that was the really big thing for us, to try and get as many as we could of the big 5 in the story. I don't think at the beginning we imagined we'd get all 5. We can talk about that, but yeah,
absolutely.
I think that was the main thing. And I think the other thing was, I think we knew we had Figo on board from the start. I don't think the project would have started without him kind of being interested. And I think he kind of liked the idea of a Netflix doc about him. But the key for us was just convincing him that we didn't want to do a kind of broad story, overarching story of his career and his life. We wanted to focus in on probably the hardest month of his life and get him to live through some pretty rough times again. So that was the trick. And once he was on board with that, I think everything started to come together.
Yeah, we're talking with the directors of the Netflix documentary El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair, David Tryhorn and Ben Nicholas here on this special edition of the Seleção Podcast. How has the documentary been received thus far, to your guys' knowledge? Because it's been out, I believe, just about less than a month, about 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I think it was released in late August. How's it been received so far, and what's been the initial feedback from both fans and maybe even folks in the footballing world?
No, I think the feedback's been great, better than we could ever have expected. Really, it's been the most watched documentary in Spain and Portugal since it was released on Netflix, or the most streamed documentary on Netflix in Spain and Portugal. From sort of cursory glances at social media every now and then, if I'm daring enough, then it seems to have created a real sort of hype and buzz. I think people are sort of actually going, wow, there's a doc on Figo that I didn't expect to be very exciting, but it's a mad story once you actually get involved in it. And it's sort of, here's this bonkers film, which has been great. And then you obviously get 10% of people saying this was clearly made by Real Madrid fans, and 10% of people going, this was clearly made by Barcelona fans. but you're always going to expect that. But no, it's done really well in Spain and Portugal. Obviously, it's so controversial and such a big story that it was always going to be very noisy. But we've been really pleased with the traction it's got elsewhere. We've had some great articles in the UK press. Footballers, people like Jamie Carragher and Ian Wright have spoken about it and loved it. So in the football world, it's gone down really well, because I think people don't get to see this side of the football world very often. They don't get to see the machinations of deals and agents. The Figo's agent in this case, Jose Veiga, and the intermediary, Portugal legend Paulo Futre, speak very, very openly and brazenly about kind of money and morals and these kind of things, that in their world, these aren't sort of big moral decisions. And I think people have found that really fascinating.
Yeah, and then with Paul Futre, I mean, I hope you guys find a way to make a documentary about him, because he must have been just a beauty to work with. I mean, I think Figo, the question was, describe Paul Futre, and he says "spectacular." It's just spectacular. Ben, this question can go to you, and then David, jump in whenever. But you guys obviously mentioned that Figo is the piece here for this documentary. Not so much the career, but the transfer itself. Obviously, mentioned Paul Foutre, mentioned Jose Vega, When I saw Florentino Perez walk into the shot, I'm like, oh my God, they got Florentino Perez to do this as well. And then Juan Gaspar, who self-admittedly said he was one of the worst presidents in Barca history. After those 5, and I'm assuming those are your 5 that you guys refer to.
Yeah.
Was it, talk to me about the process of trying to get these guys involved. Obviously, Figo is in no matter what, but getting the rest of the rest of the 5 and others like Pep Guardiola, I thought was amazing in his recollection of the time he and Figo spent together. But just in terms of those that you interviewed, how easy was it to get them on board, and how important was each of them to the success and the making of the documentary?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, Figo was on board initially. The trick with Figo was trying to get him to agree to doing the film that we wanted to do. And then what was quite interesting is that he became almost our fixer for some of the big guys. He was very useful in he was the guy that called up Jose Vega. He organized Paulo Futre. Paulo Futre actually came down one evening after we'd done Luis, so they got to have a bit of a coffee before the shoot happened, which was interesting, looking in on that from behind a smoky glass window. And Gaspar, we had contacts to get in touch with him. I think he's someone who quite likes I think he's someone who basically relives the Figo saga in his head every day in the 22 years since then. So I think he's quite keen to get it off his chest once again. Perez was the big one, really. I think we were kind of 80% into production, and we knew we had to time the request to Perez correctly. And by that time, Figo was enjoying what he was seeing, and I think we were enjoying working with him. And it became clear from talking to people that maybe the best way to get Florentino's was actually to go through Figo himself. And incredibly, we got a good answer to that. So that was the really exciting one, because I think, as much as it's a story of Figo's transfer, it also is an origin story for Florentino. And it's crazy to think about how football might be different today had Paulo Futre not answered the phone that night. Because Perez is the guy who comes into the story as a real kind of modernist, futurist, and kind of changes the landscape of football, changes how we see owners of football clubs. And so that was a huge one. And I can't remember now. Dave can maybe tell us a bit more about actually the day with Florentino. But
no, Florentino, I think we had various stipulations of how many questions, how much time we could have with him, where he wanted to do the interview, had to be in the Real Madrid trophy room. So we were then happy to convince him, no, all our interviews have a backdrop. We need to put our backdrop up. But he was very charming and very easy. Once we did do the interviews, and didn't shirk any of the questions. Obviously, he talked a little bit more in generalities and vagaries than some of the others, because he still works in football and he's a clever bloke, so he doesn't want to start a warfare with Barcelona all over again in the climate. The funny one, I'll go back on Paulo Futre, given this is a Portuguese podcast. When we spoke to him initially, he was sort of saying, "Look, I will do it, but only if I can tell the whole truth. So I need to speak to Luis first to find out if I can tell everything." So we said, when we were interviewing Luis in our first interview with him in Madrid, Paulo came down. They had a couple of coffees or a couple of beers together. Paulo holds court, obviously, for about 2 hours with everyone. We're thinking, God, it's getting late. Are we ever going to do this interview? He then came in and sort of said, "Right, how long I'm going to do it, but how long do you need?" Which, when you work with footballers, which we do a lot, is the question you always dread, because footballers only ever want to do about 5 minutes.
Sure.
And so we were like, "God, if you can give us an hour, we'd be super grateful." And he goes, "I can't do an hour." So we suddenly thought, "Oh God, all right, well, whatever you can give us, half an hour, whatever." And he said, "No, I need 5 hours to tell."
Oh, wonderful.
But I don't have 5 hours. I said, "Well, let's just do what you can today, and then we can always go back." So he ended up. I keep saying it's probably the best interview I've ever done, and I only asked him 3 questions, and he ended up speaking for close on 3 hours. So,
he was so animated in the and I mean, he was before my time. And David, as I was talking with Ben in the pre-interview, I think we're all around the same age, roughly. I'm 41, and Figo, when coming to prominence on the national team and on the international scene, I'm like right around 19, 20 years old, and I'm getting as much international football as I possibly can via satellite from Europe here in California. But the gravity of what was going on with this transfer wasn't there. But Paul Futre was a guy that before Figo was Portugal's best player at the time, and I just just his personality. I mean, it's a Figo documentary, but you could arguably say that the star of this documentary was Paul Futre. So I'm very pleased with how you guys not so much captured him, but just the way he was in the doc.
I think it's something we always saw, was that we always saw Figo as the kind of pawn in the middle of the story, because he's what I call like an executive personality, but he's an alpha male, but he's not explosively kind of charismatic. Figo, I'm talking about.
Sure.
So he's at the middle as the kind of fulcrum, and then we have these other kind of wilder, bigger characters around him, and that ended up working really well, I think. And Paolo, as you say, and I think he was obviously a world famous player in his time, but I think, as you say, he's just before our time. I think he came silver in the Ballon d'Or '87.
Yeah.
When Porto won the European Cup, so he was a huge player. And as someone we know in England, because he briefly came to West Ham towards the end of his career, so I kind of knew him from that. But the other thing I think we found really interesting about him specifically, and Vega, is that they're the two that kind of, Luis, as I said, got us those two guys. So Luis was the one who put us in touch with Vega and Futre. But they're the two whose stories, and it's a film where everyone has their own version, every truth. But they're the two specifically who I think kind of contradict Luis a bit at moments. And we found that really interesting, that Luis maybe was kind of thinking, I can't say everything, but maybe I'm going to let these two guys, my old friends, in to maybe add a bit more color to the story, or maybe not. We don't know. He might be.
Let them figuratively sign off on the documentary as well.
He had no access to Final Cut or anything in terms of giving us notes or anything. But it was interesting that who he decided to push in front of us.
But I guess also for us with those two, the sort of from a revelations point of view, and how people have kind of received the documentary too, is that certainly people in Spain already have a general knowledge of sort of how this story went down. And we always saw it as a bit of a heist movie, that it's Figo's the shiny diamond at Barcelona, and Florentino's there trying to steal that shiny diamond to cement his power and to screw over the big rivals. But I think what we were never quite aware of is it's essentially a double heist movie. That Florentino's going after Figo, but then Vega and Futre are going after the €6 million in commission. And
that was such a great. I jumped out of my seat when and I didn't mean to interrupt you there, David. But
no.
Paul Futre is, the phone has been hung up, and Vega is no longer talking to Paul Futre, and all of a sudden I got about 30-40 seconds here. Let's see what I can conjure up here, and it's all based on a lie. Again, it's not your regular sports documentary. It's like you mentioned, David. It's a heist. I think you were mentioned in the Real Screen article to be told in a Hitchcockian manner, and I thought that part, obviously the turning point of the entire documentary there, you think about it, it's like, how is this done, and how did the wheels get turning solely based on a lie by Paul Futre? Again, his truth, and we'll talk about truths later in the interview here, but just an amazing piece just an amazing part of, I should say, of the documentary there, for sure.
Well, I think it's funny at times as well. I think when we were talking about sort of sports documentaries and doing something different, I think sports documentaries can be very serious and a little po-faced at times. And I think we had these larger-than-life characters, especially in Futre, and a little bit Vega. I think there's a real charm to Jose Vega. And even though these are kind of rogues, they're lovable rogues. I think you get a sense that these are quite charming people. and we wanted to have a little bit of fun with that. And I think every time those two come on screen, it gets quite funny. You know, the idea when Jose Vega's moaning about following Figo in the beach in Sardinia with the suit and tie and everything. I still always laugh at that scene.
Absolutely. We're talking with David Tryhorn and Ben Nicholas here on a special edition of the Seleção Podcast. They are the directors and producers of El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair, the Netflix documentary, and we are lucky enough to have them here on this special episode. Mention the folks that you guys and the players and the characters, for lack of a better term, of this documentary that you guys were able to get on to be part of the documentary. Were there players or I guess were there any requests sent out for this documentary that you guys would be comfortable saying that just either respectfully declined to take part in the documentary? Was there anybody that you guys were chasing that you guys just weren't able to lock in for the documentary?
Not really. And we actually filmed quite a few more interviews that we just cut out in the end, because we ended up thinking that, as I was saying earlier, the more you feel like you're in the room with the guys, the better. So we had other players who were kind of on the outskirts of it and maybe heard rumors and all that kind of stuff. But the further into the edit we got, the more we realized the power of having just kind of Pep, Roberto Carlos, Hierro, people who Figo was kind of talking to, or people who Figo now is close with today. Because you have to leave room for if we brought other people in, it's only going to take space away from those guys. So it was really important to us to give Figo and the other guys as much time on screen as possible. What did you think of from what you knew of Figo before the film and how you now see him afterwards? Was there a shift in that, or did he come across as you kind of expected him to?
I mean, as you can see, I got my Real Madrid Figo jersey right behind me on the over my left shoulder here for those watching on YouTube. But you know, I wear these Portuguese colored glasses, and those Portuguese lenses kind of give me a soft spot for Luis Figo during this whole thing. I mean, for me, again, growing up, he was my favorite player. And to this day, I mean, Ronaldo could go down as the greatest of all time. Cristiano Ronaldo may, and it's all about, but it's, your favorite doesn't mean he's the best. And for me, Luis Figo was the epitome of what Portuguese football, especially during that golden generation, was all about. So to me, it was more just about learning more about what he went through in that transfer. And I just, does my opinion of him change? No, not really, because I think he mentions it in the documentary. Is like, he wanted to be appreciated. Again, this is his truth. He wanted to be appreciated by Barca on a monetary scale, based on what he had given the club for 4 years. And it wasn't being reciprocated. And then at the end of the day, he made a decision that he made for himself. And he mentions that towards the end of the documentary that, this was a decision I made for me. I've made mistakes. Sure. I didn't mean to hurt anybody in the process. And he wanted to go where he was valued. And I mean, in the world that, not only, I mean, as sports fans, that's hard to take if you're on the Barca side. But if you were to just kind of take a step back and be like, all right, am I going to go do I want to be someplace where I don't feel valued, or do I want to go someplace where I can go and excel, be paid more, and, be the cornerstone of a revolution that obviously has, is still felt today because of just how crazy the money is now in football transfers. So I don't think he had any idea of the impact it may have had, 20 years later, but I don't begrudge anyone who wants to, make a better life for themselves and put themselves in a better situation. So that's just me. Yeah,
it's interesting because he's a very we've ended up finding him a quite intriguing character. As I said before, he's kind of an alpha male, reluctant to show weakness, probably reluctant to ever say he's made a mistake or sorry, or and also, as you say, easy to forget what a great player he was in that era of football. because we have so much a strong recent bias when we talk about football today. I think it's easy to forget these guys. And I always think when you think back to that kind of Barca dressing room towards the end of his time, it's got kind of Van Gaal as manager, Jose Mourinho as assistant manager, hard as that is to believe, Pep Guardiola as club captain. There was Enrique, future Champions League winning manager, current Spain manager, Rivaldo. So it's almost, I would argue, the most stacked dressing room of all time in terms of egos, in terms of size of characters. And Figo in that environment doesn't just thrive; he becomes the kind of dominant personality. So I think that shows the kind of the power of Luis Figo at that time, and hopefully that comes across in the film today as well.
Let's get to the word truth. So these 5 characters all have theirs. Was the point and one of the driving forces of this documentary to try to find what the actual truth is, or was it to give these 5 characters an opportunity to tell their truth of what happened?
I think the original idea was, let's try and find out what really happened. What's the truth? And we put together this kind of painstaking timeline where we'd been digging into every single newspaper from back in the day, every single account anyone had ever given, televised or written or anything we could find around it. And we had this fairly authoritative kind of like, this is pretty much what played out, at least in the press or at least publicly. The only account missing, Jose Vega had never been interviewed on the subject before this film. So we were sort of missing his account. So that was a very key interview to do, and sort of filled in some gaps about in the timeline about him chatting to Gaspar back and forth. But I think very, very quickly in the process, we realized it would be a massive mistake to try and work out what actually happened, because we're never really going to find out. And I do think every character is telling their truth. And I think almost all of them probably believe their version of the truth and have this version that doesn't necessarily tie in with everyone else's. And that's so often what can happen in a scenario like this. And it was also a case of us having a bit of fun with it. I think you suddenly work out you've got 5 unreliable narrators. Far better for them to tell their story, and we can they can start contradicting each other throughout. And then it leaves the audience there to make up their own mind about who to trust, who they think is telling the truth, which I think from a filmmaking perspective is much more interesting. Because if we then said, right, we think this is what actually happened, we think this is the truth, then, we just become one more version of the truth that's probably wrong in parts. And I think that would have been our biggest mistake as filmmakers. I think we actually had this unbelievable opportunity to kind of set people against each other, and it makes for a much more intriguing, enthralling film.
Yeah, and despite it being quite a twisty, turny story, and you're not sure who to believe, and everyone has their own version, I think something that I like about the film now is that, as Dave says, you kind of understand on a basic emotional level. You kind of get everyone's POV. You kind of understand why Figo is becoming a bit disenchanted at Barca. You kind of understand why Gaspar would be a bit pissed off that on his first day of the presidency, he loses the best player in the world, and the guy's asking for a new contract when he's trying to win the election. You kind of get that. You kind of, Future and Vega's motivation, I think, is pretty clear. But Perez as well, you kind of get, he knows he has to do something explosive to have a chance of winning the election, and also kind of leaving his kind of his first stamp on football. And that kind of plays into something that we were really keen to do throughout the whole film, which is to tell the story, give it the context, tell it as if you're hearing it all for the first time, but to always kind of remain neutral as filmmakers, and for the film not to be kind of judgmental, for the film to never say, this guy's right, this guy's wrong, these fans were wrong, these fans were right. It's for us, we didn't feel like it was our place to say that. And we also felt the film would be stronger if we never say that, and we just kind of present to you the most kind of dramatic, exciting version of the story.
We're all human beings, so I will ask you this in a very general way without you guys incriminating yourselves. Is there a truth of those 5 that you guys believe more than the others, and is there a truth of those 5 or from those 5 that you guys are like, okay, come on, without saying who it is? because
Right.
you know it's because again, neutrality is number one, and we obviously don't want to burn any bridges here. But is there someone's truth that you guys tend to believe more than others? It could be just a simple yes or no.
Yeah, I mean, of the big five, I would say there's three that I feel like they have their own version, but they're not lying, and they kind of believe their own version of it. There's two guys who I think are the same as that, would come from the same POV as that, but I think they both know they're lying in certain moments. So there's two guys who I think could probably tell the odd lie.
So for those scoring at home, Ben is saying two guys have lied.
I think I know the three. I think I know the three and I know the two, so I'm probably going to go with Ben on that out of solidarity. We make decisions together, so I'll go with his three and his two.
But the weird thing is,
one I think is always, I feel like I'm kind of in. I think his story just tallies up best.
Gotcha. All right, we won't delve more into that.
We're remaining professional here, Derek.
Absolutely. We're not, we're not here to, and at this point, I mean, we are about 30 minutes into the interview. If you're listening to this podcast and you haven't watched the Netflix series or the documentary, spoilers are coming, so you better hit pause and then join us back here if you don't want to, because I do want to get into some of the footballing aspects of it. So
he goes to Real Madrid. That's the big score.
All right, guys. Well, that'll do it for the episode.
Nice to speak to you.
That first match at Camp Nou, what did you guys learn about that match? In the process of making this film, that either surprised you, shocked you, or just the overall atmosphere of that match, because you guys, I thought, captured it really, really well.
I think what we learned, the main thing we learned was that because since the film's been released, people have come to us and said, why don't you do a film about this? Why don't you do a film about that? The thing that we realized about this story that made it kind of unique is how it's covered. There's so much, and this is 20 years ago, so there's no kind of rolling sports news channels or anything. So just the way there was kind of daily updates on will he, won't he, and then for the match, there's kind of debate shows where people are talking about how he's going to be received. It's on the radio, it's on the TV, it's on everything. So you just the idea that you couldn't escape that match, and that there was going to be a camera following the bus, there was going to be a camera following him to the hotel, there was going to be a camera following me into the ground, out of the pitch. That's what we discovered. That's one of the things we discovered early on. And that was quite pleasing because it made us confident about making a kind of cinematic story. Is that I think for 99% of sports stories, you couldn't do that because the cameras aren't there, basically. So that's what we really discovered. That's one of the matches that you see modern football kind of coming to life in a way, in the way it's covered.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, David, go ahead.
I think that comeback match just feels so heavy. I think you don't really realize it at the time. And of course, you have two main comeback matches, the one in 2000 and the one in 2002. And I think we made a reading everything around it. Although the 2002, there's much more thrown on the pitch and it gets a bit nastier in terms of sort of missiles thrown or whatever. It was the original comeback in 2000 that was the really, really heavy one. That was the one that everyone said was just a horrific atmosphere and really poisonous, and no one really wanted to be there. That it had this sort of very different atmosphere to it.
I think there's a quote that I saw from, let's see, I think it was from a former Real Madrid defender, Ivan Campo, where he says,
"Yeah,
that night when Figo first went back was incredible. I've never heard anything like it. Luis did not deserve that. He'd given his all for Barca. It was built up before a traitor's coming, the media said. No, Luis Figo is coming. One of the greats for you. That night hurt him. You could see it. His head was bowed, and he was thinking, bloody hell, I was here last season, but my lasting emotion was admiration towards Luis Figo. Quote, you've got balls." And Luis Figo was quoted as saying, he wasn't going to miss that game because that's what a coward would do.
Yeah.
And it would pretty much feed into everything that some of the Barca fans were saying towards him and criticizing him. The one thing I my European history and my Spanish history is not great. So if you'll indulge me to see, maybe you guys can give me a little bit of background in what you've learned by making this documentary. The divide between Spain and the Catalonian area, Barca versus Madrid. How much of that, did you guys either learn more about, and how much of it do you think played a part into the feeling of betrayal between fans of Barcelona towards Luis Figo?
Look, we're on very shaky ground here, so I don't want to say anything that then gets a torrent of abuse from Barcelona or Real Madrid fans. But I think, obviously, that rivalry goes back to the Spanish Civil War in '36.
Sure.
And before, no doubt. And it absolutely plays a part in this feeling of there is a line that cannot be crossed and must not be crossed. And I think, we halfway through the film, we bring in that Catalonian context. And we think it's very important to show the viewer, Figo is asked a horrific question for a 26-year-old footballer to be asked about some Catalonian nationalism and how that ties in with the kind of this more than a club psyche at Barcelona.
Much like asking two directors from a podcaster, like what that's like to as Ben shakes his head nervously. Sorry about that, fellas. I apologize.
Ben is very happy I'm doing the talking here. But I think it was really important for us to show that Figo was asked that question, can answer it, and does understand Catalonian attitudes towards centralist Spain. So I think that is a major factor in why he was received so badly in Barcelona, because the reaction from the fans, being completely honest, it's understandable. Yes, they cross a line and it goes way too far, but it is understandable. And I think the bigger thing actually was a more trivial thing rather than sort of that regional divide. I think the bigger thing was that second interview he does with Sport newspaper, where he puts on the shirt and kisses the badge and says, "I'm staying." And I think that's the thing that really, really angered Barcelona fans, that in their opinion, there were these barefaced lies. And it's the one thing Figo will readily admit, that was the biggest mistake he made in the whole process.
It's also the fact that kind of football is the reason we're all here. The reason we've all got jobs is because football is so tribal. And I think Figo had managed to cultivate this idea in his 5 years at Barca that he was one of them. He's part of their tribe. So I don't know this for certain, but had Rivaldo done the transfer, I think it would have been a huge story. It would have been a huge transfer. Those two are probably the top two players in the world, maybe at that moment. I don't think it would have caused quite the amount of chaos, even though they would be, some people would choose Figo, some people would choose Rivaldo, only because he bought into the kind of Barca idea of more than a club, into the Catalonian idea of we're special and I'm one of you kind of thing. So that kind of gets to the heart of football fandom, really, and why football fandom and money sometimes don't mix.
And it's probably the one thing, as directors making this film, it's the one thing we never quite got to grips with and never quite understood. We absolutely understood that Figo felt undervalued by Barcelona, and this whole sort of more than a club thing. Barcelona will often use that in a slightly cultish way, I think. They expect people to subscribe to the whole more than a club thing. And I think definitely in the Nunez and Gaspar era, they expected players just to, you play for this club. This club is something different, something special. You need to adopt those values. And remembering that Ronaldo left in '97 because he wasn't being paid enough, and Inter Milan triggered his release clause. Pep Guardiola had one foot out the door. He was ready to join Parma because he didn't feel valued enough in '97. And it was only when that became a bit of a kind of scandal in Barcelona did Gaspar and Nunez move to kind of keep him at the club. So much as Figo has kind of form and history in agitating for moves or more money, Barcelona also have form and history in sort of trying to keep players on, but at minimum at not minimum wages. I'm sure they're all being paid handsomely, but at wages that perhaps weren't the market rate. So I think there is that element that sort of Barcelona used the whole more than a club thing to try and keep players and try and keep players perhaps below their market rate, and Figo suddenly didn't tap into that. But what I don't understand is then why, okay, you feel undervalued at Barca and you perhaps want to leave there, but going to Madrid felt sort of like you surely go somewhere else than Madrid, though they're the only ones who triggered.
That's the thing. Yeah, it's really easy to criticize him in a way, but his options would have been scarce at that point to try and get out to someone to pay the buyout clause. You're looking at Madrid, possibly an Italian club, but yeah, it's tough. Once he's got to a certain stage of being disenfranchised, and once he's started doing these crazy interviews, yeah, his options, are kind of dwindling by the second, I think. So it's putting yourself in his shoes. Yeah, he puts himself in a difficult position, but once he's in it, it's really hard to paint himself out of that corner, I think.
And what's quite interesting is that release clause, and this was too kind of fiddly for us to go into the film, but I think the release clause was double for a Spanish club. So I think Lazio were the only other interested club at 10,000 pesetas, which is 30 million euros in today's values. And Lazio were like, no, we can't afford that. But Madrid had to pay double because the release clause was double for a Spanish club. So for them to then be able to afford something that Lazio, who were the biggest spenders in world football at the time, were balking at half the price, just shows you sort of how outlandish the move was by Florentino Perez. And then Spaniards can talk about sort of where that money came from, but that's not for us.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that explains a lot of the stuff in the film, because the reality is I think Vega, Futre, Figo, Gaspar all thought Perez would lose. All thought he would lose, and all thought he'd just disappear into the night as this weird guy who tried to win an election in 2000. But obviously the reality was very different.
Yeah, he feels the only guy who really kind of throughout the archive footage, you can see just how confident he is. Even in our interview, he's very kind of matter of fact. I thought he wanted to come to Real Madrid. If a player wants to come to Real Madrid, they'll come. No doubts. I'm sure that's a little bit of bravado, but he does seem the only guy who was like, this can happen if A goes to B goes to C, whereas everyone else was sort of in a bit more of this, no, football's Wild West, we can do brinkmanship, we can do this, we can do that, it's unlikely it'll happen. I think Perez is the only one who actually sees the bigger picture and understands that he can trip everyone up just by inserting a fairly regular clause into a contract.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff. We're talking with David Tryhorn and Ben Nicholas here. They are the directors and producers of El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair, the Netflix documentary that is just, as a footballing fan, it's amazing. As a Portuguese soccer fan, seeing one of your greatest players, for lack of a better term, under the microscope in one of the most important parts of not only his career and the way that football business is done now, kind of seeing the birth of the big money transfers. It was amazing to watch, and I really appreciate you guys not only doing this project but your time here. A couple more questions, if I may. Documentaries are the success of documentaries. I'm not a filmmaker, so I'm going to talk out of my ass a little bit here, but I would assume that footage and archival footage is just so important to a project like this. Tell me and tell the viewers and listeners just kind of the process. There's a lot of like personal footage. I mean, you got like, Figo's kids' birthdays, and you have, pictures of him, on vacation. And then you also have, footage of, I'm guessing it's journalists following him after, he lands in Madrid. And then there's the guy on the motorcycle saying, "Where's Figo? Where's Figo?" as they approach the Camp Nou on the team bus and for the first match with Real. Talk to us about just the process as a filmmaker, and especially with documentaries, because you guys have the Pele one too, and just about how you guys go about, for lack of a term, like asking for, this kind of access and this kind of archival footage. And let's put Ben on the hot
Okay.
seat here first.
In terms of just as a kind of overall thing, you obviously you work with one of your key appointments when you're making a film like this will be an archive supervisor or archive producer. And on this film, we had a great one called Andres and a Colombian guy. And you really start just kind of doing a kind of quite a broad sweep of everything to do with it. The thing on this film was that on Pele we had a multitude of other problems. It was 1950s film. It was kind of a mixture of terrible kind of grainy stuff of him coming off airplanes and then just unbelievably beautiful stuff from 1970 World Cup and stuff like that. This was a very different one. This felt much more kind of 2000, much more kind of grimy, kind of news, digital kind of pixelated footage. So it's really, as you say, you have these kind of beautiful kind of cherries like the Figo home archive of the holiday and the kids' birthday parties, which are real gifts, and they really lend you that kind of intimacy to feel like you're in there with the guys. You're really seeing it from
looking at Pep Guardiola in a bucket hat.
Incredible, absolutely sensational look from Pep. And incredible how much their mid-90s fashion tallies with my own at the time. It's very much
absolutely
the white guy who's got a few rap records in from his dad's book.
Fantastic.
But on this film, the biggest thing I think for me was early on seeing, because we decided, okay, we want to tell this story that's based in this one summer. We want to tell the story of the deal. Obviously, the guys aren't going to have been filming themselves doing the deal. How are we going to bring it to life? So the big thing on this film, from an archive perspective, was seeing how the Spanish channels covered the presidential elections at both clubs, because that gave us this kind of daily update. This guy said this guy said that. This guy might be going for this player. Guy might be for this player. There's presidential debate shows. There's the panel shows you see in the film. So from an archival perspective, those were the real things that made us think, this is a story that should be a book. No, with this archive, this is a story that can now be a film.
Yeah, it's something to behold, to see just the footage that you guys were able to get. And Ben, I think you nailed it, especially with the news footage, the news broadcasts. Some of the reporters and the journalists that you guys were able to speak with as well, and getting their versions of what happened. I don't recall the gentleman's name. I know I've written it here somewhere, but the journalist who spoke with the journalist who spoke with then president of Real Madrid on his daughter's wedding day to Salgado of all things, and was like, listen, I'm hearing that he's gonna go, and I'm gonna run this story. And by the way, you have a really nice ceremony here for your daughter. I mean, it's just and he mentions God, what is his name?
It's Jose Ramon de la Morena, who is
yes.
He an impossible guy to translate into English in terms of his importance, because he basically is the host of Spain's biggest football radio show.
Yeah, of El Larguero.
El Larguero, and
yeah.
If that doesn't feel like a big deal to us in sort of the UK, but in Spain that's huge. He's essentially a kingmaker. He's the only one who's relaying conversations where he's essentially talking down to Florentino, and I love that wedding scene so much, because he's kind of screwing over Florentino. He's screwing over the previous president, Lorenzo Sanz, on his daughter's wedding day. He then, even another case of someone lying. He adds a lie about Florentino famously saying, if Figo doesn't come, I'll pay all the membership fees for the members for the whole season.
Or maybe it was foreshadowing, because then all of a sudden Florentino, it says, if Figo doesn't come,
has to do it, but
Florentino has to follow it up. Yeah.
He makes that up to make the story bigger. It's like, the story's already huge. Why do you need to even kind of do something else with it? But again, this other sort of, I think even when Netflix saw one of the original cuts, our commissioning editor said to us, God, if I'd broken that news en route to the reception, I probably wouldn't have gone to the wedding reception afterwards.
And shows no remorse whatsoever to all the lives he's kind of shattering in his wake.
Probably moaned about the champagne and the food as well at the reception.
But that does plug into kind of one of the big things in the film, which is this kind of idea that obviously it's Perez who comes up with he's the architect of the story, the architect of the deal. But he can't do it without the press. And so it does become, as you said, the kind of birth of the modern transfer saga. There'd been huge transfers before this, but none of them had this kind of will he, won't he, this is the story of the summer kind of feel about it. And Perez is able to kind of make the press realize they can generate as many kind of column inches, showing my age there, or clicks.
Dash 30 dash.
Exactly, yeah. During the off season as they can during the season. If you can create something that takes on this kind of mythical spirit, the fans, the press will all kind of churn it up, and almost to the point where we enjoy transfers more than trophies these days. And I think Perez, for better or worse, probably worse, we all probably agree, but Perez is the architect of that, I think, in conjunction with the Spanish press, who I think were just kind of hungry for any type of story like this, particularly if it's involving Barca Madrid.
I won't ask if it was fun, but towards the end, the meeting in Sardinia, where, and I think, David, you mentioned it towards the beginning here, where Jose Vega and Paul Foot are asking themselves, like, what are we doing here? We're walking on the beach in our suits. We're trying to get Figo to get to Real. I think of up until the point in the documentary, everything was kind of just very, it was very business. It was very, for lack of a better term, like professional in terms of like the dealings of, okay, these are negotiations. This is how business gets done. But the visual that you guys painted of just these guys just in suits, in dress shoes, walking around trying to just get a hold of Figo, and I think Paul Futre even mentioned, like, it was just like the worst day of this whole saga. Anything kind of stand out to you guys from a filmmaking point of view? That kind of backdrop, because it was maybe 1 or 2 days later that Figo decides to then sign for him personally to sign on a dotted line and become a member of Real Madrid.
Well, I think that's where the story starts to become almost a bit absurd, which is
right.
Great. And we knew this was the big pivotal 24 hours, basically, this 24 hours in Sardinia. And I think one of Ben and I's favorite lines in the film is when sort of Paulo Futre is going, it's all gone wrong. There's only one, Figo is adamant he's not going to leave Barcelona. There's only one solution. And we were always thinking, well, the only solution is that you try and get Figo out of this deal somehow with Real Madrid and keep him at Barcelona, because that's what he wants. And I always love that the only solution is we hire a private jet and go to Sardinia and try and convince him. And they sort of, these guys turn up in their suits at the lobby. And so we knew this was an amazing scene. And again, another twist that you're not quite expecting. I guess our problem with it, we were always kind of using sort of stock footage from Sardinia. We talked about going to the hotel in Sardinia to try and film, but they were closed in the off season, so weren't allowing anyone in there. We didn't know how we were going to actually illustrate this moment. And I think it was only we were just really convincing Figo to kind of, can you please look in your old, camcorder DVDs or files or whatever he shot on, and see if you've got anything around that holiday. Not expecting him to have anything or want to share anything. Then he told us, yep, no, I do have something from Sardinia, but my wife's going to have a look through it to see if she's happy with you guys having it. And I think that was such a pivotal moment for us to have this really quite impactful scene and then be able to give it the inside look that we have his sort of holiday footage. And he was very good at doing the whole, like, we're in Sardinia. It's a Tuesday or whatever. Which
narrating it, yeah.
Yeah, helps. Because, and I think there's a couple of really important. There's one cut I always love where we actually have the paparazzi footage of his wife filming Figo and his daughter building a sandcastle, and then we can actually cut to the footage that's being filmed. But I think the really important thing, it really gives you a sense of Figo's family, his daughter, his wife, and when that comes back to play in the return game, when the Barcelona fans are sort of putting up banners with Figo's young baby daughter on them, you really feel it much more, because you understand this guy. He's a family man, and he's got a small daughter, he's got a wife, and they're the ones being insulted at the game. And I think that then gives really important context later.
And it's also, that's the kind of thing you never really hear in these type of stories. I think from the outside looking in, when we see transfers, we always just presume the player, the agent, are working in tandem. But what you've got here is a guy pretty desperate at certain points in the film and is doing the interview with Tony Fierros for Sport, refusing to take his agent's calls, getting to Sardinia probably for the primary reason was just to get out of town and stop having to talk to these guys. And then seeing them land, come down in the lobby. I think that kind of stuff that's really juicy stuff. I think for us in terms of filmmakers, because you're really feeling people's emotions there, and you're really kind of going through the worst time in his life with him, and the archive stuff obviously lends to that as well.
I mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, and I asked, I should say, how the documentary has been received, and David, I think you mentioned that it's been very well received in terms of viewership at the very least in Portugal and in Spain. Have you guys been in contact with Luis Figo since the release of the documentary, and was he able to kind of watch it before the release, and what has been his reaction, if there is one?
He's watched it over 10 times, I think. We're always
he's a big fan of himself.
As
it's a wonderful story. If that was me, I'd watch it a bunch of times too.
As Ben said, he has no editorial control on the film, but he does have a right to kind of view a version sort of with 2 or 3 weeks to go in editing. So he had actually seen a version of the film, which we were very worried, how's he going to take it, whether he comes across well or not. And he's been very relaxed with it, and he was very happy with the final film. We haven't spoken to him since it was actually released, so I've got no idea if that reception, whether that changes his opinion of the film or not. I'm sure we'll find out eventually, because we do talk to his management fairly regularly. But no, all indications were that he was very happy with the final version of the film.
Last one from me in terms of the film. After doing all of the interviews, after learning so much about what happened with this transfer, and getting to know Luis Figo and his journey from Barca to Real, and this is just your guys' opinion, if he knew the fervor that this move would have caused with everything that goes on with Barca Real, with everything that was involved in the transfer, if he knew the result before making the decision, if he could be clairvoyant in that manner, do you both feel that he makes the move to Real Madrid knowing what came after it?
It's almost impossible to, I think.
Come on, Ben, make a fist. Let's go.
I think he kind of knew. I think when he's panicking in Sardinia and doing interviews, I think he knows what's going to happen. I don't think maybe he doesn't guess it's going to get quite that crazy in the comeback games or whatever. But I think he knows what he's about to do. Hence the way he looks at the unveiling. Hence the way he looks at the end of that game when the rain's kind of piling down on him. I think there's nothing that would have probably stopped him feeling a bit undervalued at Barca. And I think in his nature and in Vega's nature, they're quite flirty guys. They like talking to other clubs, maybe potentially signing some bits of paper they shouldn't have. So I think a transfer was probably on the cards anyway. And then also take into account that Barca were kind of, Van Gaal had just left. The next 5 years, they hired a kind of guy whose name I can't even remember now to follow. Ferrer. I really can't remember his name now. They had a kind of 5 really bad years with Gaspar as president and various people, and Van Gaal coming back and trying to recreate something which then became impossible. So I think it wasn't a badly timed move if you actually think about it from a football perspective. I'm sure if he could create some kind of alternate reality, he'd probably create a more comfortable move for him and his family, and something his wife was delighted with, and all that. But as we said before, his options were very limited. And knowing Figo as we do now, I think he would have done something anyway, but maybe not that exact move. But as we said before, there wasn't many other moves to make, so it was maybe he likes being the guy remembered in history for this kind of epic thing.
Hey Ben, that was a nice little humble brag. Knowing Figo like we know him now, it's very nice. I mean, Luis Figo and Pele, no big deal. They're just a couple of legends that I've gotten to know over the years. No big deal. Go ahead, David.
I think he makes the move myself, but it's I think knowing what he knows about the reaction, but then knowing if he knew what he knew about how well the stint at Madrid went, I think he why not? I think he probably makes that move. I think he seems to, as Ben said, he has that kind of alpha personality where he takes it, he takes it and he moves on.
Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you guys enough. I've got so many notes, but I'll end it there. I can't thank you guys enough for making time to come on the podcast, for making this film. It's as someone who is Portuguese and being able to see one of your footballing heroes. I mean, I just love sports documentaries in general, but this one was done in such a way where it's like it's not about his career; it's about what happened in that month, and it was so revealing and getting everyone's version of what happened. It was just such a great film, and you guys should be very, very proud of the work that you guys put into that. You guys have done now the Luis Figo one. You guys have done Pele. Without spoiling anything about what's coming up maybe in the future for you guys, are there more documentaries that you guys are trying to get off the ground here that maybe you guys don't need to mention, but is there a next project, I guess, for Ben Nicholas and David Tryhorn?
We're hoping there is.
Hopefully, yeah.
I would hope that, based off of these two that you guys done for Netflix, I would hope that there would be two. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we're hoping. These things take a while though, always. So we've got a couple of irons in fires, but nothing off the ground yet. But hopefully something within the next few months we'll be starting on again.
Come on, do the Paul Futre one. You have to.
I think someone's doing a Paulo Futre one.
That's what we heard. Yeah.
But do a better one.
It's either been done or someone's doing it, but I think there might be one out there. So sorry, we're done on that.
Yeah, well, we wish Paul Futre all the best. He's had a rough month or so. The passing of his mother, I believe he ended up having a heart attack at the ceremony. He had surgery. He's now off the smokes as he is.
We saw
in his way, a very just a charismatic way. Yeah, saying no to the cigarettes. But I again, David and Ben, I can't thank you guys enough for coming on and making time. You guys were very quickly to respond, and I can't thank you guys enough for making time for us. And good luck to you guys in the future, and all the best to you guys, and keep making great films, because this one was a great one, and I think as footballing fans and folks who just love sports documentaries and love players who get to we get to see them open up and be human. And I think that's one of the essences of sports documentaries, is that they're no longer a guy with the ball at his feet or throwing the ball in the air. These are human beings with wives, with children, and I thought you guys captured everything so wonderfully, and just again, just greatly appreciate you guys' time on this episode.
Thank you very much.
Danny. Really nice.
Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will do it for this special episode of the Seleção Podcast. Again, my thanks to David Tryhorn and Ben Nicholas. Again, they are the directors and producers of the El Caso Figo, the Figo Affair Netflix documentary, and they were just so kind with their time and joining us here on this special episode of the Seleção Podcast. Again, my name is Danny Pinto. I have been your host of this episode of the Seleção Podcast, a proud partner of Portugal.net. And as always, Força Portugal!